"If you open that gate," the sheriff said, his voice cracking through the phone, "I cannot protect you. Do you understand me, Ethan? I cannot protect you." Ethan Walker stood at his front door, rain hitting his face like bullets, watching 150 Hells Angels motorcycles rumbling toward his property in the dark. His 10-year-old daughter was behind him. His dead wife's ranch was behind him. And every survival instinct he'd built in 2 tours of combat in Iraq was screaming at him to lock the gate and walk away. He opened it anyway. If a story like this moves you, a story about one man's courage changing an entire town forever, please subscribe to this channel right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The emergency alert came through at 4:47 in the afternoon. Not the soft ping of a weather notification most people swipe away without reading. This was the full alarm, the one that made your phone scream like a smoke detector at 3 in the morning. The kind that made your stomach drop before your eyes even found the words on the screen. Severe weather warning, Pine Ridge County and surrounding areas. Category 4 storm system approaching. Wind speeds exceeding 110 miles per hour. Residents are urged to seek shelter immediately. This is not a drill. Ethan Walker read it once. Then he set his phone face down on the kitchen counter, picked up his work gloves and walked outside. There was no panic in his movement. That was just Ethan. 11 years in the Marine Corps had burned the panic out of him a long time ago, replaced it with something quieter and more dangerous, a focused stillness that people in Pine Ridge sometimes mistook for coldness. He wasn't cold, he just knew that panic didn't fix anything. Work did. "Dad?" Lily appeared in the doorway, still in her school clothes, holding her math homework with both hands, like it was the most important document in the world. She was 10 years old and small for her age, but she had her mother's eyes wide, dark, and missing absolutely nothing. "Dad, my teacher sent a message. She said we should stay inside." "Your teacher's right," Ethan said without turning around. "Go put on your boots and come help me with the horses." "But the alert said, Lily." He looked at her then, and something in his voice settled her the way it always did. Not harsh, never harsh with her, but certain. "The horses need to be moved to the main barn before this hits. I need your help. Can you do that?" She studied him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she disappeared back inside to get her boots. That was Lily. She was her father's daughter in all the ways that mattered. The Walker Ranch sat on 17 acres on the eastern edge of Pine Ridge, Montana. A small, tight-knit community of about 4,000 people, the kind of town where the hardware store owner knew your grandfather's name and the diner had been serving the same apple pie recipe since 1974. Ethan had grown up here, left at 18 to enlist, come back 12 years later, with a Purple Heart, a wife named Claire, and a dream of turning his family's failing property into something that could sustain them. For 6 years, that dream had been working. Slowly, painfully, with the kind of grinding effort that left calluses on your hands and satisfaction in your chest. He and Claire had rebuilt the barn, added a small stable, purchased 10 horses, and started offering trail rides and riding lessons to families in the summer months. It wasn't a fortune, but it was theirs. Then Claire got sick. 18 months ago, she had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. She fought it the way she fought everything, quietly, stubbornly, with a kind of grace that made everyone around her feel ashamed of their own small complaints. But the cancer was faster than her stubbornness. She died 8 months ago on a Tuesday morning in March, with Ethan's hand in hers and Lily asleep in the chair by the window. Since then, Ethan had been running the ranch alone. He hadn't talked much about how hard it was. That wasn't his way. He got up every morning at 5, fed the horses, got Lily ready for school, worked the property until dark, made dinner, helped Lily with her homework, and then sat alone on the porch for 30 minutes before bed, the only 30 minutes of every day that were entirely his. Neighbors sometimes saw the light on his porch and wondered what he thought about during those 30 minutes. Nobody asked. People in Pine Ridge respected a man's silence the way they respected a fence line. You didn't cross it unless you were invited. He had 16 horses that afternoon, big animals, nervous in bad weather, and they needed to be out of the open pasture and into the main barn before the storm arrived. Ethan and Lily worked side by side for an hour and a half, leading each horse through the worsening wind, latching gates, checking water troughs, reinforcing the barn doors with the extra timber Ethan had cut 2 summers ago for exactly this kind of situation. Storm's getting close, Lily said at one point, squinting up at the sky. The clouds had turned a color she didn't have a word for, not quite green, not quite black, something in between that made her skin feel tight. Yeah, Ethan agreed. He checked the last latch on the barn door, tested it twice, and looked down at her. Last one, good work, kid. She almost smiled, almost, but she was still watching the sky on. By 6:30, the rain had started in earnest, not drizzle, not shower, but a full wall of water that turned the world gray and cut visibility to less than 100 yards. Ethan made dinner while Lily set the table, their movements around each other, easy, and practiced a small choreography they developed over months of just the two of them figuring it out together. He made pasta because it was fast and because Lily would eat it without complaint, and they sat down across from each other at the kitchen table. The same way they did every night, same chairs, same places. Claire's chair at the head of the table, empty the way it had been for 8 months. They didn't talk about Claire's chair. They never talked about it. It was just there. Dad, Lily said, twirling pasta around her fork. At school today, Tyler Brannigan said his dad heard there was a biker gang coming through the valley. Ethan looked up. Where'd he hear that? From the gas station, I think. She set her fork down. Tyler said they're dangerous. He said his dad said they kill people. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up enough that the kitchen windows were beginning to rattle in their frames. Tyler Brannigan's dad, Ethan said carefully, is a man who once told me the drought of 2019 was caused by cell towers. Lily stared at him. Then, despite herself, she laughed. A real laugh, the kind that had been harder to come by since March. Ethan watched it happen and felt something loosen in his chest. Just eat your dinner, he said. At 8:15 p.m., his phone rang. It was Deputy Cal Hendricks, who had been a year behind Ethan in high school and was now the second most senior officer in the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department. Ethan, Cal said without preamble, you need to lock everything down right now. Already done. Horses are in, barn is secured. That's not what I mean. There was something in Cal's voice that Ethan hadn't heard before. Not exactly fear, closer to bewilderment. We've got a situation developing about 8 miles east on Route 9. You're the closest property to the road on that stretch. Ethan set down his coffee mug. Talk to me, Cal. About 150 Hells Angels are pinned down on Route 9. Storm's boxing them in, they can't go forward, can't turn back, and there's no shelter anywhere near them. They've already had 2 riders go down in the wind. One of them might have a broken collarbone. Cal exhaled hard. We're trying to figure out what to do, but the truth is we don't have anywhere to put them. Motels are full, the emergency shelter's already at capacity with the Dennison family and some of the folks from the trailer park on Mill Road. Sheriff's thinking we might have to just leave them on the road and hope they... How far out are they? Ethan asked. What? Cal, how far out are they from my front gate? A long pause. Then you don't have to. How far? Maybe 10 minutes. 15 if the road's washed out near the creek bed. Ethan stood up from his kitchen table. He walked to the window and looked out into the dark and rain and saw nothing but the motion of wind in the trees. He thought about Claire for a moment, not about losing her, but about something she used to say. The bravest thing you can do is be decent when it costs you something. Tell them to come to my ranch, Ethan said. Silence. Ethan, I've got a main barn, a livestock barn, and a secondary storage structure. If we clear the floor space, I can get all of them out of the weather. Horses are already secured. Tell them to come. Do you understand who these people are? Cal's voice had dropped like he was trying not to be overheard. Hell's Angels, Ethan, not some weekend riders club. The real thing? Their record. Their riders are going down in 100-mile-an-hour winds, Cal. That's what I understand. Ethan's voice was steady. That military stillness, again bone deep and unshakable. Tell them to come. I'll open the gate. Another silence. Longer this time. I'll pass it along, Cal said finally. But Ethan, the sheriff's not going to be able to get anyone out to you. Not in this weather. You understand that you're on your own. I've been on my own before, Ethan said. He hung up. From the kitchen doorway, Lily was watching him. She had heard everything or enough of it. Her pasta sat half-eaten on the table. Her eyes were doing that thing, that wide, missing nothing thing that was all her mother. Dad, she said quietly, are you really going to let them in? Ethan looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he reached for his rain jacket on the hook by the door. Go upstairs, he said. Lock your bedroom door. Don't come down unless I come get you. Dad, I need to know you're safe, he said, and his voice softened in a way it only ever softened for her. Can you do that for me? Can you let me handle this while I know you're okay upstairs? She searched his face the way she always did when she was deciding whether to trust him. She'd never once decided not to. She gave a single small nod. I'll be right here, she said. I know you will. He touched her face briefly, one hand her cheek, just for a second. Then he pulled on his rain jacket, grabbed his flashlight, and walked out into the storm. The sound hit him before the sight did. He'd been expecting motorcycles. What he heard instead was something between a thunderstorm and an earthquake, a deep rolling mechanical roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the hills and through the wet air with a force that he felt in his sternum. He'd heard artillery fire that was less impressive. He walked to his front gate, a wide rolling ranch gate with a combination lock, and stopped. His phone rang again. Sheriff Dale Purcell this time. Not the deputy, the man himself. Ethan Walker, Purcell said, and his voice had that measured political quality that small-town sheriffs developed when they'd been in office long enough to know that everything they said might come back to them someday. I understand you've offered to shelter these individuals. That's right. I want to advise you strongly against this decision. I hear you, Sheriff. These men have... I hear you, Ethan said again more firmly, and I respect your position. But I was a Marine for 11 years. I've been in situations where someone opened a door for me when they didn't have to, and it kept me alive. I'm not going to stand here in the rain and leave 150 men without shelter because of what I think they might do. I'm going to open this gate. A silence so long Ethan thought the call had dropped. Then, if anything happens on your property, I cannot protect you. Do you understand me, Ethan? I cannot protect you. I understand, Ethan said. He hung up. He spun the combination on the gate lock. He pulled the gate open, and they came. Not in a rush, not in chaos. They came in a long, slow, disciplined column, 2 riders wide, moving at barely 10 miles an hour through the sheeting rain. As the first headlights swept across him, Ethan raised his flashlight and began waving them toward the main barn. He stood in the rain doing this, just standing there, waving them in, and the riders passed him close enough that he could see their faces. They were not what he expected. He didn't know exactly what he'd expected. Something from a movie, maybe. Something theatrical and threatening. Snarling faces. Menacing eyes. What he saw instead were men who were exhausted and soaked and cold. Their jackets plastered to their bodies, their hands rigid on their handlebars from gripping through the wind. He saw a man of about 60 whose leather vest was so waterlogged it had darkened almost to black. He saw a younger man, couldn't have been more than 25, whose face was a mask of controlled fear that Ethan recognized immediately, the face of someone who was keeping it together through sheer will, because falling apart wasn't an option right now. He saw men who were tired. He waved them in, all 150 of them. It took 11 minutes for the full column to pass through his gate. Ethan stood in the rain for all of 11 of those minutes, flashlight raised, pointing the way. By the time the last bike rolled through, he was soaked to the bone, and his shoulder ached from holding the light up, an old injury shrapnel from Fallujah, something that flared in cold and wet. He lowered his arm and turned to face what he'd done. 150 Hells Angels on his property in his barn, in the middle of the worst storm in 50 years. The rational part of his brain, the part that Cal Hendricks and Sheriff Purcell had been trying to reach, suggested quietly that this might have been a serious mistake. The other part of his brain, the part that had carried wounded men off burning streets in Iraq, the part that had held Claire's hand in a hospital room and refused to leave even when the nurses told him he should go home and rest, that part was completely calm. He walked toward the barn. The inside of the main barn was warmer than the outside by maybe 20 degrees, which wasn't saying much but was saying something. The horses were in the far stalls, and they were nervous. Ethan could hear them shifting and stamping, could hear the low, uneasy sounds they made when the world felt wrong. He made a mental note to check on them once he had a read on the room. The bikers had spread out across the open barn floor. Some were still on their bikes, straddling them, hands working gloves off stiff fingers. Some had dismounted and were simply standing still, apparently trying to decide what to do with themselves in this unexpected situation. The barn smelled of rain and exhaust and leather and animal, a combination that should have been unpleasant and somehow wasn't. They watched him walk in, not aggressively, not with challenge or hostility. They watched the way men watch someone when they're trying to take his measure carefully, quietly, waiting to see what kind of man he really was, now that there were no cameras and no audience. A man stepped forward from the group. He was big, not in the inflated performative way of men who spend too much time at the gym, but in the way of someone who had simply been large his entire life and had gotten used to it. Broad through the shoulders, thick through the chest, with hands that looked like they'd been designed for gripping. His beard was iron gray and his hair was pulled back. His cut, the Hells Angels leather vest, was older than most of the men in the barn, its patches faded and earned. He moved through the crowd without touching anyone, and they parted for him without thinking about it, the way water parts around a stone. He stopped in front of Ethan. He was maybe 55. His eyes were brown and direct and completely unreadable. "Mason Reed," he said. His voice was deep and controlled, and flat, the voice of a man who never wasted it on unnecessary volume. "I'm the president of the Montana chapter." "Ethan Walker," Ethan said. "This is my ranch." Mason Reed looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You opened your gate. You needed somewhere to be." Another pause. Something shifted in Mason's eyes, infinitesimally small, the kind of shift that most people would have missed. Ethan didn't miss it. "You know who we are," Mason said. It wasn't a question. "I know what people say about who you are," Ethan said. "I've found that's usually a different thing." Mason studied him for 3 full seconds. Then he looked around the barn at his men, at the horses in their stalls, at the battered infrastructure of a working ranch that had seen better days. When he looked back at Ethan, something in his face had settled. "We won't be any trouble," he said. "I'm not worried about trouble," Ethan said. "I'm worried about that collarbone. Cal Hendricks told me one of your riders went down. Where is he?" Mason blinked. Just once, like he hadn't expected that. "Back left," he said, and jerked his head toward the corner of the barn. "Kid named Danny Watts, 23 years old, came off his bike about 2 miles out." Ethan was already moving in that direction. "You got a first aid kit in your gear. We've got a guy with some field medicine training." "Good. Tell him to meet me there. I've got a kit in the tack room." Ethan paused and turned back. "Your men need to eat. I can't feed 150 people, but I've got coffee and I've got enough to get a few pots going. That'll take the edge off." Mason stared at him. "What?" Ethan said. "Nothing," Mason said. And then quietly, something that Ethan wasn't sure he was meant to hear, "Nothing, just nothing." He turned and started issuing quiet, specific instructions to the men nearest him, and within 60 seconds, the barn had a different quality to it, a purposefulness, an organization that materialized from chaos the way Ethan recognized from his own military experience. These weren't random men. They had structure. They had hierarchy. They moved like men who trusted each other, which meant they'd been through something together. He filed that away. Danny Watts was in the corner, sitting on a hay bale, his jacket half off, and his face the color of old chalk. He was young, really young, the 23 that Mason had said, looking more like 19 in the lamplight, with a neck tattoo and eyes that were bright with the specific kind of brightness that meant he was fighting back, showing how bad it hurt. "Hey," Ethan said, crouching in front of him. "Danny." "Yes, sir," Danny said automatically, and then looked faintly embarrassed by the sir. "Can you rotate your shoulder?" Danny tried. He got about 15 degrees and then made a sound through his teeth that was as close to a scream as a man could get without opening his mouth. "Okay," Ethan said. "Stop. Don't do that again." He ran his hands carefully along the collarbone, watching Danny's face for the reaction. He found it a spot just lateral of center, where Danny went completely rigid. "Here, yeah," Danny managed. "It's broken," Ethan said. "Not displaced, which is good news. You're not going to need surgery, but you're going to be wearing a sling for 6 weeks and you're going to hate every day of it." He sat back on his heels. "How'd you come off?" "Crosswind caught me. 1 second I was on, the next I wasn't." Danny paused. "Happened pretty fast." "They usually do." The man with field medicine training arrived then, mid-40s, heavy set a scar through one eyebrow that had healed crooked. He introduced himself as Brick and displayed a level of competence with the splinting and immobilization that told Ethan he had not learned it from a YouTube video. "Military?" Ethan asked. Army, Brick said without looking up from what he was doing. 68 whiskey, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 68 whiskey, combat medic. Yep. Who else? Ethan asked, and he said it loud enough that the men nearest to them could hear. Brick glanced up then. His hands kept moving, competent and automatic, but his eyes found Ethan's, with something that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite hope. Who else what? He said. Who else here has a military background? The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. Then from somewhere in the middle of the barn, a hand went up. Then another. Then another. Ethan stood up slowly and looked out at the sea of hands. He counted. 47 hands. He stood there in his own barn and looked at 47 raised hands and felt something shift in his chest. Not surprise exactly, but something that went deeper than surprise, something that settled in and changed the shape of things. 47 veterans, in his barn, in a storm, calling themselves outlaws. Marines, he said. 3 hands stayed up. He gave a single nod that those men returned without hesitation, the specific acknowledgement that Marines give each other, economical, unspoken, complete. He looked at Mason Reed, who had been watching this from 6 feet away. His arms crossed his face, unreadable again. You could have told me, Ethan said. Would it have changed anything? Mason said. Ethan thought about that, about the gate and the phone calls, and Claire's voice in his memory. The bravest thing you can do is be decent when it costs you something. No, he said. Something moved in Mason's face again. Something that was working hard to stay controlled and was losing that fight by fractions. Didn't think so, Mason said. Outside, the storm was building. Ethan could hear it in the walls of the barn, the deep structural groaning of a building under serious pressure, the howl of wind finding every crack and seam and testing them. The temperature inside had dropped another 5 degrees since the riders arrived, and despite the mass of bodies and the warmth of animals, there was a collective chill running through the barn that had nothing to do with weather. Ethan walked to the corner of the barn where his secondary generator was hooked up, checked the fuel level, and switched it on. The light steadied and brightened. Somewhere in the crowd, someone actually exhaled in relief. He heard it clearly. It was the kind of sound that stayed with you. He went to the tack room and started the coffee. 8 gallons of water, everything he had. He'd worry about tomorrow. When he came back out, he found something he hadn't expected. 3 of the bikers had quietly located his bale hook and were redistributing hay from the far stacks to the open floor space, creating a series of rough but genuinely comfortable places to sit or lie down. 2 others had found his emergency lanterns and were hanging them from the cross beams, improving the light distribution across the whole barn. And a heavy-set man in his 60s, his gray beard impressive enough to be a statement on its own, was standing at the stall doors running a calm, experienced hand along the nose of Ethan's most anxious horse. A bay mare named Rosie, who normally didn't allow strangers within arm's reach, and Rosie was letting him. Rosie was leaning into it. Ethan stopped. He watched the man with Rosie for a moment. You've worked with horses, he said. The man glanced over without moving his hand. Grew up on a ranch in Wyoming. Used to break horses for $3 a head when I was 15. He looked back at Rosie. She's a good animal. She's scared, though. Storm makes them nervous. Yeah, the man said. Storms do that to everyone. He said it simply without weight, but Ethan heard the weight in it anyway. He stood there for a moment in his barn surrounded by men. He'd been warned we're the most dangerous kind, watching one of them calm his frightened horse in the middle of the worst storm in 50 years. Then he went to check on the coffee. From upstairs in the house behind her locked bedroom door, Lily Walker was sitting on her bed with her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the storm and the distant sound of voices from the barn, low, overlapping, strangely peaceful, not at all what she'd imagined. She had her mother's photograph on the nightstand, the one from their wedding day where Claire was laughing at something just outside the frame. Lily looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she got up, put on her second sweater, and went quietly downstairs. She was her father's daughter in all the ways that mattered. She was not going to sit upstairs while history happened in the barn. Lily Walker had been told twice in her life to stay somewhere safe while her father handled something dangerous. The first time was in the hospital when her mother was in surgery, and her father had sat her down in the waiting room with the juice box and a coloring book and said, "Stay here, don't move, I'll come get you." She had stayed for 45 minutes. Then she had gotten up, walked down the hall, and found him sitting alone outside the surgical suite with his head in his hands, and she had climbed into the chair next to him and put her small hand on his arm, and neither of them had said a word. The second time was tonight. She was 9 steps from the barn door before she stopped herself. Not because she was afraid, because she was thinking, which was something her mother had always said was Lily's best and most underused quality. You think well when you slow down enough to do it, baby. Most people never slow down enough. She thought about what her father had said. I need to know you're safe, not stay upstairs because it's dangerous. He'd said it like her safety was the thing that would let him function. Like knowing she was okay was the wall that kept him steady. She turned around and went back inside. But she went to the kitchen window instead of upstairs, the one that looked out toward the barn, and she stood there in the dark watching the light leak through the barn's old timber walls, listening to the low rumble of voices that she still couldn't make into words. And she stayed there like that for the next hour, because staying in the kitchen window wasn't breaking the rule, not technically. Inside the barn, the coffee had become something more important than coffee. It happened the way it always happens without anyone deciding it should. Ethan came out of the tack room with the first pot, and there was a quiet, immediate reorganization of the space around him. Men moved, not because they were ordered to, but because there was hot coffee and they were cold, and something fundamental in the human animal responds to that combination, the same way it has for 10,000 years. They gathered. They cupped their hands around whatever vessels Ethan had been able to locate: mugs, thermoses, 2 mason jars. He was mildly embarrassed about a tin cup that had been hanging on a hook since his grandfather's time. Nobody complained about the mason jars. Ethan poured. He didn't talk much while he poured, and neither did the men receiving the coffee. And this shared silence had a quality to it that he recognized from overseas, the specific quiet of men who are taking a moment together before whatever comes next. It was Mason who broke it. He appeared at Ethan's elbow with a mug already in his hand, black. No sugar, the kind of coffee preference that said something about a man, and he stood there for a moment, not saying anything, watching Ethan pour for the men still coming forward. You're running low, Mason said. I've got 2 more pots worth, Ethan said. After that, water. Mason nodded. Then how long you been out? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He knew what Mason was really asking, and he was deciding whether to answer the real question or the surface one. 8 months, he said, since my wife died. No condolence? No, I'm sorry for your loss in the practice. Slightly hollow way people said it. Mason just nodded once, the way men nod when they recognize something they've carried themselves. The ranch doing okay, he said. Doing, Ethan said. Not okay, but doing. How many horses? 16. I had 22 when Claire was alive. Sold 6 after. He paused. Couldn't manage them alone and get Lily to school and keep the rest of the operation running. Had to make the math work. Mason was quiet. I hated selling those horses, Ethan said, and he said it in the flat tone of a man stating a fact rather than asking for sympathy. But the flatness itself was a kind of honesty that was harder than any emotion would have been. Mason looked into his coffee mug. I had to sell my house, he said. After I got back from my second tour, couldn't make the payments, couldn't hold a regular job. He paused. Turns out 11 months in Kandahar rewires something. The wiring doesn't exactly go back the way it was. Ethan looked at him. This was the first thing Mason had said that wasn't functional, wasn't logistics or assessment or leadership. This was something else. Ethan took it seriously. What branch? Ethan said. Army, 75th Ranger Regiment. Ethan gave a low sound that wasn't quite a whistle. 2 tours with the Rangers, and you ended up here. 2 tours with the Rangers, and I ended up everywhere, Mason said. Here is just the current stop. He took a long drink of coffee. The club was the first thing that felt like a unit again, first thing that felt like I belonged somewhere. He glanced at Ethan sideways. I know how that sounds. It sounds like every veteran I've ever met, Ethan said, including myself. Something in Mason's posture shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. I was going to ask you why you opened your gate, Mason said, but I think I already know. Yeah, Ethan said. I think you do. They stood in silence for another moment, and it was a different silence than before. Less cautious, more settled, the silence of 2 men who have located each other across what looked like a wide distance, and found that the distance was mostly made of other people's assumptions. Then from the far end of the barn, someone started talking and everything changed. It was a man named Gerald, 61 years old Vietnam veteran, the one who had been calming Rosie. He had sat down on a hay bale with his coffee and was talking to the younger man next to him, Danny Watts, the one with the broken collarbone, his arm now immobilized in a proper sling that Brick had constructed with quiet expertise. Gerald wasn't talking loudly, but in the way of barns which have their own acoustics, the words carried. First night back stateside, Gerald was saying, I walked into a bar in San Diego, still in uniform. Thought people might, I don't know, I was 20 years old. I thought maybe someone would buy me a drink. He paused. Bartender asked me to leave, said I was making the other customers uncomfortable. Danny was quiet. His broken collarbone was keeping him still, but his eyes were on Gerald. What did you do? Danny asked. I left, Gerald said simply. Walked around the block 3 times. Then I walked back in, sat back down, and ordered a beer with my own money. And I drank it alone. He looked at his coffee. Sometimes the only answer to being told you don't belong somewhere is to stay anyway. Something about that landed in the barn. Not dramatically, not with music underneath it, just landed. Ethan saw it happen, saw the way the men nearest Gerald got a little quieter, a little more still, the way people get when something true is said in their presence. He thought about the gate. Stay anyway. He had opened the gate, but these men, they'd been staying anyway their whole lives in a country that kept asking them to leave. Before he could follow that thought further, the barn door opened. The wind hit first a brutal lateral gust that took 3 coffee mugs off the shelf Ethan had been using as a makeshift counter and sent them spinning. Every head in the barn turned toward the door. Every body tensed with the collective reflex of people who have trained themselves to track threats. Standing in the doorway, soaked and furious, in about 5 feet 4 inches of absolute indignation, was Deputy Cal Hendricks. He stood there dripping on Ethan's barn floor, and he looked at the 150 Hells Angels in Ethan's barn, and his face went through approximately 4 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. Ethan watched all 4 of them arrive and depart. Walker did, Cal said. Cal, Ethan said. I told you. You told me you couldn't protect me. I understood that. The sheriff. Cal. Ethan's voice was quiet, but it cut through the barn air with that precision he'd learned in the military. Not volume, never volume, but clarity. The kind of clarity that ends sentences before they finish. Come inside, you're getting the floor wet. Cal stepped inside. The barn door swung shut behind him. In the sudden relative stillness, 200 eyes were on him, and Cal Hendricks, to his credit, did not visibly panic. He swallowed once. That was all. Mason Reed stepped forward. He moved unhurried and direct the same way he moved through his own men. He stopped in front of Cal and looked at him with those flat, measuring eyes. Deputy, he said. Mr. Reed, Cal managed. We appreciate the town's concern, Mason said. There was nothing in his tone that was sarcastic. He genuinely meant it, and that was what made it remarkable. We won't overstay our welcome. Storm brakes were gone. Cal stared at him. He'd clearly come in prepared for confrontation and had no frame for this response. Yeah, he looked at Ethan. There's been some calls. I bet, Ethan said. People in town they're worried. The Hargrove family is particularly... Cal stopped. He looked around the barn again. At Gerald with Rosie, at Brick wrapping Danny's shoulder, at 3 men quietly restacking hay bales into more stable formations. They're cold, Ethan said, and wet and tired, like anybody would be. Cal opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I'll call the sheriff, he said finally, which was not what he'd come here to say, but was apparently the only thing his brain could produce right now. You do that, Ethan said. Coffee's in the tack room. Help yourself. Cal looked at him for a long moment. Then he went and got coffee. It was 9:47 when Lily appeared. Not dramatically, not with announcement. She simply opened the barn side door, the smaller one that Ethan used daily that she had been coming through since she was old enough to walk, and she was there in her boots and her second sweater with her father's old Marines baseball cap on because she'd grabbed it off the hook by the door on her way out. She had a pot of hot water in both hands held carefully, her expression one of total concentration. She had made more coffee. She had found the second tin of grounds in the pantry, filled the pot from the tap, put it on the stove, and carried it to the barn at the age of 10 in the middle of a historic storm because there were people who needed it, and her father was busy, and it was the obvious thing to do. Ethan saw her first. The look on his face was complex pride and fear and helpless love and resignation, all of it at once. He opened his mouth. "I'm not upstairs," she said before he could get a word out. "But I'm also not outside. I'm here, which is safe, and I brought coffee because you're running low. Mama always said you can't be hospitable without coffee." She met his eyes with a steadiness that had no business being in a 10-year-old's face. "Don't send me back." He stared at her. She stared back. Behind him, someone made a sound, low, involuntary, somewhere between a laugh and something that wasn't a laugh at all. Ethan turned and saw that it was Mason, and Mason was looking at Lily with an expression that had bypassed all his careful blankness and reached something much older and more unguarded underneath. "How old are you?" Mason asked her. 10, Lily said. 11 in March. "You're not scared," he said. And he said it genuinely, not testing her, not performing, but asking as if the answer actually mattered to him. Lily considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She looked around the barn, at Gerald and his coffee, at Danny and his sling, at the wet, tired men finding places to sit and beginning slowly in the way of very tired people to settle. "You don't look scary," she said finally. "You look like you've been outside for a long time." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Gerald laughed from his hay bale, a real laugh, full and genuine, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine in a man's chest. And once Gerald started, something loosened in the barn, the way something always loosens when laughter happens in the middle of something hard, and 3 other men laughed, and then more, and the sound of it was strange and good, and big enough to push back against the sound of the storm outside. Lily walked to the tack room and poured the hot water into the coffee setup with careful, practiced hands. Ethan watched her do it and said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't obvious. His daughter was her mother's daughter too. The storm outside was climbing. Ethan could track it by the barn, by what the building was doing. The walls were not concrete or steel, but old timber. The kind of timber that had flex in it, and when the wind hit hard enough, the barn didn't resist. It breathed. It moved fractionally in ways that an experienced rancher could feel through his feet. Ethan had been feeling it for the last hour, monitoring it the way a sailor monitors the behavior of a ship in rough water. Not in panic, but in the constant low-level calculation of someone who needs to know when concern becomes emergency. The barn could handle what it was handling, he was fairly sure. But the wind was still building, and there was a quality to it now that he didn't love. A depth, a patience, like it was warming up. He pulled Mason aside at 10:15. "Wind's not done," Ethan said quietly. Mason had felt it too. Ethan could tell by the fact that he didn't ask what Ethan meant. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know yet. The alert said a Category 4 system. I've been in Category 4s before. What I'm feeling in this building right now is something deciding how hard it wants to commit." He paused. "If it commits fully, this barn holds. It's been standing since 1987, and it was built heavy. But anything weaker in this county is not going to have a good night." Mason's jaw tightened. "The town." "The town," Ethan confirmed. They looked at each other. "Your emergency services," Mason said. "How many units?" "Small department, 8 officers, 2 EMTs, maybe 2 more available on call." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "This storm is county-wide. They'll be stretched to nothing within an hour if it escalates." Mason was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor, and Ethan watched him run the calculation. It was a specific kind of calculation, though: logistics of available people, likely situations, allocation of resource, and the way Mason ran it told Ethan more than anything else had yet about who this man actually was. "I've got 47 veterans in this barn," Mason said slowly. "I've got brick. I've got men who've pulled people out of rubble in Kandahar and Mosul and places you've never heard of." He looked up. "What I don't have is authority in your town." "You don't need authority," Ethan said. "You need someone to vouch for you." Another pause. "Would you, Mason said. Ethan looked at him steadily. "I already opened the gate." And then Cal Hendricks' radio erupted. The sound of it cut through every other sound in the barn, through the storm, through the voices, through Gerald's conversation and Danny's careful breathing around his broken collarbone. It was the specific piercing burst of an emergency dispatch frequency, and every veteran in that barn, every man who had ever lived by radio contact and known that certain tones meant certain things, went rigid in the same instant. Cal fumbled for the radio, his coffee mug hitting the floor. The voice on the other end was barely coherent, high-pitched, breaking apart in static, but the words came through. Rotation confirmed, I repeat, rotation confirmed on ground radar tornado warning issued for Pine Ridge and adjacent shelter immediately. This is not a repeat. This is not a watch. This is a warning. The barn went absolutely silent. Ethan and Mason were already moving. Get your men up, Ethan said, and his voice had shifted into something that had no room in it for anything except the next necessary action. I need your best people, not everyone. 12, 15 people who can move fast and follow instruction and think on their feet. Tell the rest to stay here with the horses and keep the structure calm. Mason turned without another word. Brick, Gerald, Tanner, Ross. The names came out rapid and flat, and the men whose names he called were moving before he finished saying them. Cal had the sheriff on the line. Ethan could hear it from across the barn, the sheriff's voice tight and controlled and trying not to be frightened, detailing what was coming and where. And as he listened, Ethan's mind was already 3 steps ahead, already mapping Pine Ridge's geography in the dark, already thinking about the elementary school on Barlow Street, about the nursing home on Route 9, about the trailer park on Mill Road, where he knew the structures wouldn't last in a direct hit. Lily appeared at his side. Dad, she said. He looked down at her. She was looking up at him with those eyes, wide, dark, misting nothing, and she wasn't asking for reassurance. She was asking for information. She was asking what he needed. He crouched down to her level. Listen to me very carefully, he said. There is a storm shelter under this barn. You know where it is. The hatch by the east wall, she said immediately. That's right, I need you to go there right now and take anyone who can't come with us, Danny, and his shoulder, anyone else who's hurt. Can you do that? Yes, she said without hesitation. You stay down there until someone comes for you. Don't come up for any reason. Do you understand me? I understand. He looked at her face for one more second. She looked back at him with a steadiness that broke something open in his chest and simultaneously held him completely together. You're so much like her, he said. He didn't have to say who. Lily swallowed once. I know, she said quietly. Go, Dad. He stood up. He turned to the 15 men Mason had assembled, Brick and Gerald, and a dozen others, faces he didn't know, but eyes he recognized, eyes that had seen the kinds of things that make a man capable and willing when it counts. And he said the thing that needed to be said. Pine Ridge is about to get hit. We're the closest able-bodied people in this county. Nobody is making you do this. You're already safe in this barn and nobody will fault you for staying. He looked from face to face. But if you're coming, we go now. Not one man moved backward. Gerald set down his coffee mug with a quiet final sound. Brick pulled on his jacket. The man named Tanner, who Ethan would later learn, had done 3 tours with the 82nd Airborne, rolled his neck once and looked at Mason. Same as always, Tanner said. Just wetter. Mason almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile Ethan had seen on his face. Ethan went to the barn door. He put his hand on it. Outside, the sound of the wind had changed deeper, now lower pitched, a sound that he felt in his jaw, in his back teeth, and somewhere below his sternum. The kind of sound that an organism learns over millennia to recognize as wrong. He pushed the door open. The night came in with a howl that seemed to have opinions about it. Ethan Walker, single father, Marine. Veteran man who could not save his wife from cancer or stop grief from hollowing out. The last 8 months of his life walked out into the storm. Behind him, 15 Hells Angels veterans walked out with him without hesitation, without being asked twice. Cal Hendricks, deputy sheriff of Pine Ridge, Montana, stood in the barn doorway and watched them go. He stood there for a long moment. Then he grabbed his radio. Sheriff, he said, his voice steadier than it had been all night. I've got a volunteer emergency team mobilizing from the Walker property. 15 men, multiple veterans, 1 combat medic. They're heading into town. A pause. Yes, sir, I said, Hells Angels. I also said they're volunteers and they're heading your way. Another pause. No, sir, I don't think we're in a position to turn them down. He clipped the radio back on his belt. Behind him in the barn, Lily Walker was guiding Danny Watts toward the hatch by the east wall, her hand on his good arm, her voice calm and matter-of-fact, telling him to watch his step, and it wasn't far, that she'd been down there before, and it was solid and it was safe. Danny looked at her, this 10-year-old girl leading him through a crisis with her father's quiet steadiness, and he thought about the kind of man who raised a daughter like that, and he thought about what it meant that that man was currently walking into a tornado with 15 of his brothers. Your dad, Danny said, is something else. Lily didn't break stride. Yeah, she said simply, he is. She opened the hatch and then went down first and reaching back up to help him with the steps, and the storm above them screamed and screamed, and the barn held, and the night was nowhere near over. The tornado touched down at 10:41 p.m. Ethan knew the exact time because he was looking at his watch when the sound changed. Not loud or different. The way a freight train is different from wind, even when both of them are trying to kill you. There is a mechanical quality to a tornado that has nothing to do with weather. It sounds like something built, something with intention. And when it touched down 2 miles northwest of Pine Ridge's center, Ethan felt it in his feet before he heard it fully, a vibration that came up through the ground like the earth itself was clearing its throat. Move, he said to the men behind him. Not loud, not panicked. The single word that means everything when the people hearing it know how to respond to it. They moved. The 15 men spread into a loose formation behind Ethan and Mason without being told to, spacing themselves the way men with military experience space themselves, automatically close enough for communication spread enough that a single point of impact doesn't take everyone. Cal Hendricks had gotten his patrol truck out of the ditch at the side of Ethan's drive and was moving parallel to them on the road, his radio a constant stream of incoming damage reports that Ethan was parsing in real time. Barlow Street, there's a structure collapse on Barlow Street. Cal's voice crackled through the window he'd rolled down. Elementary school, reports of people inside. Ethan and Mason looked at each other across the dark. People inside the school, Mason said, at 11 o'clock at night. Emergency shelter, Cal said, his voice dropping. Principal opened it up this afternoon for families who didn't have basements. There's, he stopped, static. Then dispatches saying 30, maybe 40 people, families, kids. The word kids hit this group the way words sometimes do not, as sound but as weight, something that physically changes the posture of every man who hears it. Ethan saw it happen, saw shoulders straighten and jaws set, and something move behind 15 pairs of eyes. That wasn't fear and wasn't anger, but was the particular resolve of people who have decided that what happens next is not negotiable. How far, Ethan said. 6 blocks, Cal said. Drive, Ethan said. They ran. 6 blocks in a Montana storm with 70-mile-an-hour sustained winds and debris moving through the air at speeds that turned ordinary objects into weapons. A 6-block run was not a 6-block run. It was a controlled chaos of ducking and angling and using each other's bodies as windbreaks, of moving in bursts when the gusts dropped and flattening against whatever was solid when they surged. Tanner, the 82nd Airborne veteran, ran like he was back in a combat zone, his body low and efficient, and twice he grabbed the arm of the man next to him and hauled him sideways around something in the dark that Ethan didn't see clearly, but heard make a sound when it hit the ground behind them. They heard the school before they saw it. The sound was the kind that you don't have language for until you've heard it, the specific groan and crack of a load-bearing structure, failing something, giving way that was never designed to give way. It was the sound of the certainty of buildings becoming a question mark, and it was ongoing, which meant it wasn't done. What used to be the school's east wing was down. The main building was intact, but the east wing classrooms, the gymnasium overflow area, the corridor that connected them had taken a direct hit from the edge of the rotation and simply folded. Not explosively, not the way you see in movies, but deliberately, the way a tired man sits down heavily in a chair, the way something decides it has had enough. There were people in there. Ethan could hear them before he reached the debris field. Voices muffled by concrete and timber, and the continuing howl of wind, but present and specific and therefore alive. He grabbed Cal by the arm as the deputy came around his truck. Call count, Ethan said. How many were confirmed inside? 37, Cal said. He was holding his radio in one hand and his phone in the other, and his face had the look of a man who is being asked to track too many things at once. 37 checked in. Principal Dorsey had a list. Where's Dorsey? Main building. She's with the people who made it to the main hallway before the east wing went. Get her on the line. I need to know where the others were when it came down. Ethan turned to Mason. How do you want to split this? It was a specific thing asking Mason that. Not deferring, Ethan knew what he would do. He was asking because Mason knew his men and Ethan didn't, And in a situation like this, the fastest way to get people killed was to assign them jobs without knowing what they could do. Mason didn't hesitate. He was already scanning, already calculating. Brick takes 3 men, goes for the sound of voices in the north section. That's the corridor by the sound of it. I take 4, work the gymnasium side from the west, where the structure looks most accessible. You, he pointed at Ethan. You coordinate from here, keep communication open, direct whoever comes through to Cal's truck. You're the one Dorsey will talk to. You're the one who knows this town. It was a clean, fast, tactically sound division of resources. Agreed, Ethan said. Mason was already moving. Brick, north section, 3 men go. Gerald Tanner, Ross Villanueva on me. And they went, just like that. No hesitation, no discussion, no fear that paralyzed into inaction. Just a simple practice motion of men who have been in bad situations before and have learned that the only way through is forward. Ethan got Principal Dorsey on Cal's phone. She was breathing in the short, controlled way of someone managing their own panic through sheer professional will. Margaret Dorsey had been running Pine Ridge Elementary for 19 years. She was 63 years old and had handled lice outbreaks and budget crises, and a parent once pulling a gun at a school board meeting. She was not a woman who fell apart, but her voice right now was walking a very fine line. The Morrison family, she said the moment she heard Ethan's voice. Jim Morrison, his wife Paula, their 3 kids. They were in the East Corridor. I had them in the corridor because the gym was full, and I put them in the corridor because I thought the interior wall. Dorsey, Ethan said. Are they the only ones unaccounted for? A pause that was about 1 second long and felt like 10. The Hendersons, elderly couple. They were in the classroom at the far end of the East Wing. I don't know if I haven't heard from them since. We have people in there right now, Ethan said. Good people. You just keep who you have calm and stay on this line. He turned back to the debris. Brick had found the corridor. It was the sound that guided him, a child crying steady and high and clear, which told Brick 2 things instantly. There was a child alive in there, and the child was not buried under something that was compressing their lungs, because you can't cry like that if you are. He got down on his hands and knees at the edge of the collapse and put his face close to the gap where the east wall met the fallen ceiling section, and he said loudly and deliberately, calm, "My name is Brick. I'm a medic. Who can hear me?" A voice, adult, female, strained. "Here, we're here. My husband. He's hurt. Something's on his leg. I can't. The kids are okay, but Jim." "Paula," Brick said, a pause. "How do you know my name?" "The principal told us." "Paula, I need you to keep talking to me. How many of you are in there?" 5. "Me, Jim, and our 3 kids. Alicia is 8, Marcus is 6, baby Sophie is 4. Her voice cracked on Sophie, just once. Then she pulled it back. "Sophie's scared, but she's okay. The boys are okay. Jim, I can hear him breathing, but he's not. He won't wake up." "Okay." Brick turned to the 3 men behind him. The ceiling section came down on a diagonal. Look at the angle. There's a void underneath right here. He pointed. If we can move this exterior timber 12 inches, we open a gap big enough to get kids through first. He looked at the 3 men. "Tell me what you can do." The man named Ross, heavyset, early 40s, with the quiet confidence of someone who has moved heavy things professionally, looked at the timber and said, "Got it." He positioned himself, got his hands under, and nodded to the man next to him. They moved it. Not 12 inches. 14. Ross made a sound that came from somewhere very deep in his body, and the timber moved, and Brick was already in the gap, his flashlight moving, his voice steady. "Alicia, Marcus, Sophie, I need the kids to come to my voice. Mom's going to help you move toward the light. Can you do that?" The sound of small bodies moving. The particular rustling and bumping of children being carefully repositioned by their mother's hands. And then a small face appeared at the gap. Dark eyes, a scratch above one eyebrow. A 4-year-old named Sophie, who looked at Brick with the absolute uncomprehending seriousness of very young children in situations they don't understand. Brick reached in and took her. He passed her back to the man behind him without ceremony, the way you pass something precious in a relay, firmly, completely trusting the next set of hands. Marcus came next, then Alicia, then Paula herself, who emerged from the gap, gasping, and immediately turned back around. "Jim," she said. "He's next," Brick said. "Stay with your kids." He went back in. Jim Morrison was 41 years old, and he had a collapsed section of interior wall across his lower right leg. He was unconscious, not dead. Brick confirmed that in the first 5 seconds, pulse present and stronger than expected. But the leg was a problem. The leg was going to need to be addressed before Jim Morrison went anywhere because moving him wrong would turn a compression injury into something that cost him the leg entirely or worse. Brick worked for 4 minutes and 20 seconds in a half-collapsed school corridor in a Montana tornado, using 2 pieces of broken timber as improvised levers, and the combined strength of Ross and a man named Tomas, who had been a Marine Scout sniper and therefore had arms like suspension cables. And at the end of those 4 minutes and 20 seconds, Jim Morrison was free. He came around as they were carrying him out. He opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was a massive man with a Hells Angels patch carrying him like he weighed nothing, and he said in the fog of someone not fully conscious, "Am I dead?" "Not today," Ross said. Outside, Paula Morrison grabbed her husband's hand the moment they cleared the debris, and she held it with both of hers, and she was crying in a way that had no sound to it. Just her face doing things that faces do when the thing you were most afraid of didn't happen. Ethan was at Cal's truck relaying everything to Dorsey, tracking Mason's team by sound and the occasional flicker of flashlights through the wreckage on the gymnasium side. So far, 5 out. Jim Morrison breathing and conscious and about to be furious about his leg when the adrenaline wore off. 3 kids unhurt, Paula Morrison unhurt. The Henderson couple was still in there. He heard Mason before he saw him, not Mason's voice, but the specific controlled commotion of Mason's team hitting something unexpected. A change in the rhythm of their work, a sharp exchange between 2 voices, a sound that made Ethan straighten up from the truck and start moving before his conscious mind had finished processing the signal. He found Mason at the far end of the gymnasium debris where the wall had come down at an angle that created something like a lean-to, unstable, precarious, but still standing, which meant there was a void underneath. Mason was on his stomach with half his body inside the void and his legs still outside, and he was completely still in the way of someone who has stopped moving because moving would be the wrong thing to do. "What have you got?" Ethan said, crouching beside him. "2 people in here," Mason said, his voice low and controlled. "Elderly couple. The woman is responsive. The man, Onin," he stopped. "He's under a section of gymnasium bleacher. It came down across his chest." Ethan felt the weight of that settle. "How much bleacher?" "A lot," Mason said flatly. "He breathing?" "Yes, barely. He's conscious. His name is—" A pause, Mason apparently asking. "His name is Franklin Henderson. He's 78 years old, and he just told me to stop hovering and do something useful." Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. "Sounds like Franklin Henderson. You know him?" "Would be a hoped. He coached my little league team when I was 9. Toughest man I've ever met who wasn't in the military." Ethan looked at the structure above the void. He looked at it carefully, the way a man looks at something when the assessment he's doing has direct consequences for human lives. He did not rush the assessment. Rushing it would be worse than taking the time. The bleacher section, is it resting on him or is it braced by the debris around it? Mason felt around in the dark. A pause. "Braced," he said. "It's caught on the wall remnant on the right side. It's not putting full weight on his chest, but it's in contact. And the brace point is not stable." "If the brace goes," Ethan said. "Yeah," Mason said. They didn't finish that sentence. They didn't need to. Ethan called Tanner over. He looked at Gerald and then at Villanueva, a former Army Ranger who hadn't said more than 12 words all evening, but whose hands had been useful for every single one of the last 40 minutes. He looked at the structure. He looked at Mason, still half inside the void, maintaining contact with Franklin Henderson, by presence alone, by the sound of his voice, which was the most important thing anyone could do right now. "Tanner," Ethan said, "you and Villanueva are going to take the right side. Gerald, you and I take the left. We don't lift the bleacher, we stabilize the brace point. We're buying time for Mason to get them out, not trying to be heroes. Controlled and slow." "Everybody clear." 3 men said "clear" in overlapping tones that together sounded like one word. "Mason," Ethan said. "Ready," Mason said, and his voice from inside the void was steady and certain and carried the weight of a man who has decided that what happens next is his responsibility. "On 3, Ethan said. 1, 2, 3. They took the weight. Not all of it. Enough. The brace point steadied, and the section stopped its micro movements, and Mason moved. He went fully into the void, and there was a period of about 40 seconds, the longest 40 seconds Ethan had spent since a certain street in Fallujah, during which none of the men holding the structure looked at anything except the point they were holding, and none of them said anything except what was necessary. And the only sound from inside the void was Mason's voice, low and continuous, talking to Franklin Henderson, the way you talk to someone when you need them to stay present and trust you. "Franklin, stay with me. I've got your wife. She's right here. She's okay. Her name is Ruth, and she's holding my hand, and she wants you to hold on. You hear me? Ruth is right here, so you hold on." Franklin Henderson's voice, thin but present and unmistakably itself. "Tell her she left the stove on." From the darkness of the void, Ruth Henderson made a sound that was crying and laughing at the same time, which is the sound of someone who has just been reminded of every ordinary day they still want to have. Then Mason was moving again, and Ruth first, her hand in his, her small frame guided through the gap with a care that was almost formal, like Mason was escorting her somewhere important. And then the angles shifted, and Ethan said, "Hold," and they held, and Mason repositioned himself under Franklin's arms, and he pulled slow and direct and without drama, and Franklin Henderson came out of that void 1 inch at a time until he was clear. He was breathing. His chest was bruised badly. Brick would confirm 2 cracked ribs when he examined him 90 seconds later, but his spine was intact and his heart was his own. And when Ruth found his hand in the dark, she gripped it so hard, her knuckles went white, and she did not let go. Ethan stood up from his crouch. His arms were shaking from the sustained effort of holding the structure. Around him, Tanner and Villanueva and Gerald were doing the same, rolling their shoulders, flexing hands, breathing through the release of tension. Nobody said anything about the shaking. It was honest and earned, and that was all. Mason emerged from the debris last. He stood up to his full height and looked at Ethan. And he was dirty from the rubble, and one side of his face had a cut above the cheekbone from something he'd brushed against inside the void, and he looked more fully and completely like himself than he had at any point since walking into Ethan's barn. 37 people, Ethan said. All 37. Mason looked at him. Dorsey just confirmed on the radio, Ethan said. All 37 people who checked into that shelter are accounted for. Alive. Mason was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved once. Just once. "Jim Morrison's leg," he said. "Brick says he'll keep it. 6 weeks off it, but he'll keep it." Mason nodded. He looked at the debris field around them, the school, the town, the darkness full of wind that was finally beginning to pull back. The rotation had passed. The sustained howl was becoming something more ordinary. The storm wasn't over, but its worst intention had been spent. Gerald, who was 78 years away from Vietnam and still had all of himself, sat down on a chunk of concrete and put his face in his hands for a moment. Not crying, just being still inside something large. Ethan recognized it. He let it be. Then from somewhere in the dark behind them, a voice. A woman's voice. Not from the debris, from the street, from the direction of town. And then another voice. And then a light someone with a flashlight coming toward them at a run. It was Donna Hargrove, 54 years old, owner of the Pine Ridge General Store, whose husband Frank had called Cal Hendricks twice during the evening to demand the bikers be removed from Ethan Walker's property. She was wearing a rain jacket over what appeared to be pajamas, and she was running with the particular graceless urgency of a person who is not a runner, but has decided that running is required. She reached them. She stopped. She looked at Mason, at Gerald, at the debris field, at the 2 EMTs now loading Jim Morrison and Franklin Henderson into the single ambulance that had arrived 90 seconds ago. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Mason looked at her. He was still bleeding from the cut above his cheekbone. He was covered in rubble dust. He said nothing, asked for nothing, just looked at her with those flat, direct eyes. "My neighbor," Donna Hargrove finally said, her voice stripped of everything that wasn't essential. "Rita Calwell. She's 71. She lives alone on Maple. She called me 20 minutes ago and said her roof was, I can't get to her. My car won't start, and I don't..." Her voice broke. She pulled it back. "I don't know who else to call." Mason turned to Tanner without a word. Tanner was already pulling out his phone for the address. "We'll go," Mason said to Donna Hargrove. "What's the house number?" She stared at him. This man with the Hells Angels patch and the cut on his face, who had just pulled 2 elderly people out of a collapsed school, asking her for a street address so he could go help her neighbor. 417, she said. 417 Maple Street. Got it. Mason looked at Ethan. You good here? Go, Ethan said. I'll coordinate with Cal, do a sweep of Mill Road, the trailer park. Mason nodded. He took Tanner and two others, and they moved off into the dark, and Donna Hargrove stood and watched them go, and her face was doing something complicated and honest that she probably hadn't planned on anyone seeing. Ethan touched her arm lightly. They're good people, he said. She looked at him. She was a woman who prided herself on being sensible and measured and not being the kind of person who made hasty judgments that she then had to walk back. She had been the kind of person who called her husband and said, tell Cal Hendricks to get those people out of there, and who had meant it and had believed she was being sensible. I know that now, she said quietly. He didn't say I told you so. It wasn't the moment for it, and it wasn't his way. He just nodded and moved toward Cal's truck and got back to work. The next 2 hours were a blur of motion and decision, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort alone, but from the sustained emotional cost of being present for other people's worst moments. Mill Road gave up 4 families from the trailer park, all of them intact, all of them shaken, 2 of them with minor injuries that Brick handled with his field kit and his 68 whiskey training and the calm of a man who has done this in considerably worse conditions. Mason's team found Rita Calwell at 417 Maple Street with a section of her roof open to the sky and the woman herself sitting in her kitchen drinking tea with the serene practicality of someone who has decided that the appropriate response to a tornado removing your roof is to have tea and wait for someone sensible to arrive. She apparently approved of the bikers who arrived at her door because she made them all tea too. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Ethan's radio Cal's spare, which Cal had handed him 3 hours ago, went quiet in a way that meant something different from before. Not the quiet of waiting for the next call, the quiet of a situation that has spent itself. He was standing on Barlow Street outside the school when Mason walked back to him from the direction of Maple Street. Mason's jacket was torn at the shoulder from something that had caught him during the Rita Calwell operation, and he was moving with the heavy, deliberate care of a man who has been running on operational focus for several hours and is now beginning to feel the body underneath. They stood together and looked at the school and the street and the aftermath of what the night had been. Body count, Mason said. 0, Ethan said. Mason exhaled, a long, slow, complete exhale, the kind that takes something with it. In 30 years, he said, of being told I was dangerous and reckless and bad for whatever community I happened to be near. He stopped, looked at the school. 0. 0, Ethan said again. They stood there at the post-storm dark, 2 men on either side of a line that had been drawn by other people and had turned out in the end to be mostly imaginary. The wind had dropped to something almost gentle. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking with the irritated persistence of a dog who has been told to stay inside and considers this arrangement unfair. The town was standing. Every person who had been inside that school shelter was alive. Franklin and Ruth Henderson were at the county hospital, Franklin's ribs being assessed, and Ruth refusing to go to a separate room under any circumstances. Jim Morrison was in surgery for his leg, and Paula Morrison was in the waiting room with her 3 children and a nurse who had brought them hot chocolate because there was nothing else useful to offer. Rita Calwell had declined a hospital visit, had thanked Mason's team with the firm graciousness of a woman who has been deciding who deserves her gratitude for 71 years and applies that standard without exception, and had gone to bed. Ethan's phone rang. It was Lily. He answered it immediately. Hey, everyone's okay down here, she said. Her voice was steady and matter-of-fact and slightly hoarse in the way of people who had spent several hours talking to scared people in small spaces. He would later learn, spent the last 3 hours in the shelter with Danny and 4 other injured men, telling them about the horses and about her mom and about the time her dad accidentally made 12 gallons of chili for a church potluck that was expecting 8 people, and the telling of these stories had kept 4 men sufficiently calm and distracted through the worst of it. Danny's doing okay. His collarbone hurts, but he's not complaining. Well, he's complaining, but in a way that means he's okay. Ethan pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. Good, he said. That's good. Dad, her voice changed, quieter. Is everyone in town? Everyone's okay, he said, a pause. Then Mom would be really proud of you right now. He couldn't speak for a moment, just stood in the middle of Barlow Street in Pine Ridge, Montana, the storm spent and the town standing, and let that be true. "Come home," Lily said. "I'll make more coffee." He laughed. It surprised him, the genuine full quality of it, breaking through the exhaustion and the emotion and the weight of the last several hours like light through a crack. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming home." He hung up. He looked at Mason. "My daughter says there's coffee." Mason looked at him for a moment. Something moved in his face that had been working its way to the surface all night. Something that the control and the blankness and the responsibility of leadership had been holding back, and that the night had finally worn through. "Lead the way," Mason said. They walked back through the dark streets of Pine Ridge, and behind them the town was battered and raw-edged and strewn with the evidence of what had tried to take it apart. And ahead of them at the end of the road, a ranch gate stood open, and a light burned in a barn window, and a 10-year-old girl with her mother's eyes was making coffee for anyone who needed it. The town was standing. They had made sure of it. They came back to the ranch at 3:14 in the morning. Not triumphant, not loud. They came back the way men come back from something real quietly, with the particular heaviness of people who have spent everything they had and are now running on the last thin reserve before the body demands its accounting. Boots dragging slightly, voices low, the kind of tired that sits behind the eyes and makes the world look slightly farther away than it actually is. Ethan pushed open the barn door and Lily was there. She had not slept. She was sitting on a hay bale near the tack room with Danny Watts beside her, his sling clean and his color better than it had been 3 hours ago, and she had a thermos of coffee in her lap that she had apparently been guarding with the seriousness of someone protecting something irreplaceable. When she saw her father, she stood up. She didn't run to him. She stood up and looked at him the way she always looked at him, taking inventory, checking for damage, running through her own private assessment, and then she walked to him and put her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest and held on. He held her back, both arms completely the way he had held her in the hospital the day Claire died, and the way he held her on the bad nights when she dreamed about her mother and woke up confused and afraid. He held her the way a man holds the one thing in his life that is entirely irreplaceable. "Everyone," she said into his chest. "Everyone," he said into her hair. She pulled back, looked at him once more, nodded. Then she turned to the men filing into the barn behind him, and she lifted the thermos. "Coffee's not hot anymore," she said, "but it's there." Gerald laughed first. Of course it was Gerald. He laughed, and it was the same real laugh as before, the one that came from somewhere genuine in a man's chest. And once it started, it spread the way it had before, catching in the exhausted men, the way a match catches in dry grass, fast and warm and welcome. Mason stepped past Ethan into the barn and looked at the space. The men who had stayed, the 135 who had remained through the storm, who had kept themselves calm and kept the horses calm, and who had waited, they were awake. Some of them had slept in shifts. Ethan could tell by the hay indentations in the positions of people, but they were all awake now, watching the returning team come in. And the returning team was changed in a way that the remaining men could read, the way you read a page, the dirt on their jackets, the specific quality of their exhaustion, the way they moved into the barn. Not like men who had survived something, but like men who had done something. Nobody asked what happened. The asking came later in the way of men in quiet exchanges and fragments, and the slow piecing together of a shared night from individual accounts. For now, the returning men simply came in, and the remaining men simply made room, and the whole thing had a quality that Ethan recognized as something he hadn't felt in years. Unit cohesion, the specific warmth of people who have been through something together and don't need to announce it. Danny Watts found Mason immediately. He was up and moving despite his collarbone, with the determination of a 23-year-old who has decided pain is someone else's problem tonight. "Everyone okay?" Danny said. "Everyone," Mason said. "Town?" "Standing." Danny absorbed this. His jaw worked. "I should have been there," he said, and the frustration in it was real and raw and young. Mason looked at him for a long moment. "You were exactly where you needed to be," he said. "You kept the people in that shelter calm for 3 hours. Brick told me." He paused. "That matters, Danny. That's not the small job." Danny opened his mouth, closed it. Something moved behind his eyes that he was apparently 23 years old and not yet experienced enough to hide. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You stayed," Mason said simply. "Sometimes That's the whole thing. Ethan heard that from across the barn. He heard it and he thought about Gerald's words from earlier in the night. Sometimes the only answer to being told you don't belong somewhere is to stay anyway. And he thought there was something in these men that had been forged by being told to leave for so long that staying had become the deepest act of defiance they knew, and maybe the deepest act of love. He went to check the horses. Rosie was still nervous. She would be nervous for another day. Horses carrying the memory of storms in their bodies the way people carry the memory of accidents in theirs. But she was okay. All 16 were okay. He moved through the stalls, quietly checking water, checking for any injury or distress, running his hand along each animal's flank in the way that was more about communicating than checking. I'm here. The worst is over. You're all right. He was at the far end of the stalls when he heard someone come in behind him. It was Gerald. The old man moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had filed a formal complaint about the last several hours, but whose will had overruled it. Mind some company, Gerald said. Never, Ethan said. Gerald stopped at the stall next to Rosie's and looked at the horse inside a gray gelding named Captain, 10 years old, the steadiest animal on the property. Captain regarded Gerald with the mild, interested calm that some horses have naturally and some earn over years of good handling. Gerald reached up and let Captain smell his hand before touching him. You grow up with horses, Ethan asked. Until I was 17, Gerald said. Then Vietnam. He ran his hand along Captain's nose. There's something about horses. They don't care what patch you're wearing. They care if you're honest. Ethan watched him. You've been with the club long. 22 years, Gerald said. Joined when my wife left. Couldn't blame her. I wasn't good to be around for a long time after I came home. The wiring problem. He said wiring problem with a sort of rueful familiarity, like it was a phrase he'd used so many times it had worn smooth. By the time I got better, she'd built a new life. I don't hold it against her. You can't ask people to wait that long. You have kids, a daughter. She's 38 now. Gerald's hand kept moving along Captain's nose. We talk. We're working on it. That's more than a lot of guys have. He looked at Ethan sideways. Your girl, Lily, she's something. She really is, Ethan said. She sat with Danny for 3 hours in that shelter, and she talked about her mother. Just talked about her like Claire was someone she wanted Danny to know. Gerald paused. Danny told me she talked about her mom like she was still in the next room, like she was just temporarily somewhere else. Ethan had to look away for a moment. He looked at Rosie. He breathed. That's how Lily makes sense of it, he said finally. I don't correct her. I don't know enough to know if she's wrong. Gerald made a sound that wasn't quite a word, but contained something old and understood. No, he said. I don't think any of us know enough for that. They stood with the horses in the quiet end of the barn for a little while, the two of them, and it was one of those conversations that means more in the silences than in the words, the kind you can only have at 4 a.m. after a night that has stripped everything unnecessary away. At 5:45 in the morning, the sun came up over Pine Ridge. It came up on a town that was battered and raw and scattered with debris on streets that would need weeks of work to clear on homes with missing roofs and businesses with broken windows and a school with a collapsed east wing that would require rebuilding from the ground up. The sun came up on all of it with the complete indifference of nature, which does not acknowledge what it has done and does not apologize. And it came up on something else. All 150 Hells Angels were still at the Walker Ranch. Not sleeping, working. It had started as the best things start without announcement or coordination simply because it was obvious. The storm was over, the immediate crisis was past, and there was work in front of them that needed doing, and they were people who knew how to work. 3 men had walked out into Ethan's drive at first light and started clearing fallen branches from the road. 3 more had gone to the fence line at the north pasture that had taken storm damage and were assessing what needed to be repaired. Brick had set up a rudimentary triage point near the barn entrance and was systematically checking every man who'd been out in the field for injuries that the adrenaline of the night had obscured. By the time Ethan came out of the barn at 6, they were everywhere. He stood in his driveway and looked at his property being worked over by 150 people with the focused efficiency of a crew that has its own internal logic and doesn't need to be told what needs doing. It was one of the stranger sights of his life, and his life had contained some genuinely strange sights. Mason appeared at his shoulder. He had a coffee mug, one of Ethan's, the old blue one with the chipped handle that had been in this kitchen since Ethan's parents' time. He handed it to Ethan. "Your fence line on the north side took a hit," Mason said. "3 posts down. Tanner did fence work in Wyoming before he enlisted. He's got it." Ethan took the coffee. He looked at the mug for a moment. Then he looked at Mason. "You didn't have to do this." "No," Mason agreed. "We wanted to." The distinction mattered. Ethan heard it, understood it, and let it stand without comment because commenting on it would diminish it. "You know the town's going to talk," Ethan said. "The town's going to talk regardless," Mason said. "At least now they have the right material." Ethan drank his coffee. The morning was cold and clean in the way mornings are after a big storm washed clear, the air stripped of everything that isn't essential, the light coming through at a low angle that made everything look more itself. "What happens now," Ethan said, "for your chapter?" Mason thought about that. "We move on. That's what we do." He said it without self-pity, which made it sadder than if he'd said it with self-pity. "We move on. We ride. We find the next place." He paused. "That's not a complaint. It's just the shape of things." Ethan nodded slowly. He was thinking about something. He was thinking about it in the way he thought about things that mattered, carefully turning it over, checking it for cracks, the way you check a structure before you put weight on it. "You said last night that the club was the first thing that felt like a unit," Ethan said. "First thing that felt like belonging somewhere." "Yeah," Mason said. "Every one of those 47 veterans in there, they found belonging in your club because they couldn't find it anywhere else." Ethan looked at him steadily. "That shouldn't be true. That's a failure of something larger than any of you." Mason was quiet. "I know," he said. "I want to say something to your men," Ethan said. "Before you go, all of them. Would that be okay?" Mason looked at him with the careful measuring look he'd had since the beginning. Then he nodded once. "I'll call them in." It took 7 minutes to get all 150 men assembled in the main barn. 7 minutes in which Ethan stood at the front of the space trying to think about what he actually wanted to say, which turned out to be harder than expected, because what he wanted to say was large and imprecise, and the things that matter most are always the hardest to compress into language. Lily appeared beside him. She had apparently decided this was not an event she was going to miss. "You'll know what to say," she said quietly. He looked down at her. She was looking up at him with her mother's certainty, not reassurance, something more muscular than that. Certainty, like she had already calculated the outcome and was just waiting for him to catch up. The barn got quiet, 150 men looking at him, tired, dirty, real. Men who had been called dangerous and criminal and outlaw for so long that some of them had started to believe it the way people believe anything that's said about them, with enough consistency and conviction. Men who had gone into a burning situation the night before without hesitation and had brought everyone out alive. Ethan didn't clear his throat. He didn't shuffle his feet or look at the ground. He just looked at them. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 10 years old. And when I told her you were coming, when I told her there were 150 Hells Angels on their way to this ranch, the first thing she said wasn't, 'Are they dangerous?' She said, 'But where will they sleep?'" He let that sit for a second. She was 10 years old and she understood something immediately that took the rest of this county all night to figure out. That what a person needs is more important than what a person's reputation says about them. The barn was absolutely still. "I know what you were told when you came home," he said. "I know because I heard versions of it myself. I know what it feels like to come back from something that changed you and find that the place you came back to didn't leave any room for what you'd become. I know what that costs." He stopped, breathed. "Last night, every single person in Pine Ridge who needed help got it. 37 people in that school shelter, 4 families on Mill Road, an old woman on Maple Street who made you all tea and probably enjoyed the company." A ripple moved through the crowd, not quite laughter, something warmer. 0 casualties. In a direct tornado strike on a town of 4,000 people. 0. He looked from face to face. "That is what you are. Not what the patch says and not what people decided about you before they knew you. What you are is what you did last night." Nobody said anything. Then Danny Watts, 23 years old, broken collarbone, and all started to clap. It was awkward with one arm and it looked slightly absurd, and he did it anyway with the conviction of someone who has decided that the awkwardness is beside the point. And then Gerald clapped. and Tanner and Ross. And then the whole barn was doing it, not the polite rhythmic applause of an audience responding to a performance, but the specific irregular full-bodied sound of people responding to something that hit them somewhere real. Mason did not clap. He stood at the side of the room and he looked at Ethan, and the expression on his face was the one he had been suppressing since he walked into this barn the night before. Unguarded, direct, the face of a man who has been offered something he didn't know he still needed. Ethan gave him a small nod. Mason returned it. The moment was interrupted, as the important moments always are, by the sound of tires on gravel. Multiple vehicles. Ethan frowned and moved to the barn door and opened it. The parking area in front of his house had filled up. Pickup trucks. Cars. A van from the local Methodist church with Pine Ridge Community printed on the side. People were getting out, townspeople, Pine Ridge residents, people Ethan had known his entire life. He saw Tom Levitt, who ran the hardware store, climbing out of his truck with a cardboard box that smelled even from this distance like food. He saw Karen Briggs from the diner with two of her waitstaff, each carrying covered trays. He saw Dave Purcell, the sheriff's brother, not a man Ethan had ever considered particularly warm, with a case of water bottles and the specific look of a person who is not sure they deserve to be here, but has come anyway because the alternative is worse. And he saw Donna Hargrove. She was standing at the front of the small crowd that had gathered in his driveway, and she was holding a covered dish in both hands, and her face was composed in the careful way of a woman who has spent the last several hours confronting something uncomfortable about herself and has decided to let the confrontation win. She stepped forward when she saw Ethan in the barn doorway. "My husband wanted to come," she said. He's working on it." She paused. "He has more distance to cover than I did, but he's working on it." Ethan looked at the dish in her hands. "What did you bring?" "Casserole," she said. "It's what I do when I don't know what else to do." She said it with a self-awareness that was new in her, a slight roughness, the sound of someone who has had a layer sanded off. He stepped aside and gestured toward the barn. "Come on in," he said. "We've got a lot of people to feed." She walked in. The people behind her followed, and the barn underwent another of its transformations, from shelter to rescue staging point, to this something that didn't have a clean name, but that felt in its specific combination of exhausted strangers sharing food in the early morning light, like the word community, if you took it seriously for once and meant all of it. The conversations that started in that barn in the early morning hours were not comfortable. Comfort would come later, and for some people it would take longer than others. What happened first was harder and better than comfort. It was the specific, awkward honesty of people who have been on the wrong side of something and know it and are trying imperfectly and in real time to be on a different side. Tom Levitt from the hardware store sat down next to Tanner, the 82nd Airborne veteran, and said with the blunt directness of a man who has decided that the only way through is straight, "I want you to know that I called the sheriff last night to ask him to get you people off Ethan's property, and then I watched from my window while you went into that storm." He stopped. "I don't have a speech prepared. I thought someone should say it to your face." Tanner looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said, and then simply, "What did you bring in that box?" Tom blinked. "Breakfast burritos," he said. "My wife made them at 4 in the morning." "I could eat," Tanner said. Tom handed him 2. They sat there together eating breakfast burritos in Ethan Walker's barn, and the conversation that came next was ordinary and real and went on for 45 minutes and covered Tom's hardware store and Tanner's time in Afghanistan, and the fact that they had both at some point in their lives owned the same model of Ford pickup and had the same opinion about its transmission. It was not a grand reconciliation. It was better than that. It was 2 specific men sitting in a specific place, figuring out that the distance between them had been mostly made of other people's ideas. At 9:30 in the morning, Sheriff Dale Purcell arrived. He arrived in his official vehicle, in his official capacity, and he walked into the barn with the measured deliberateness of a man who is doing something that costs him something and has decided the cost is appropriate. He was 58 years old and had been sheriff of Pine Ridge County for 14 years, and he had a record that was by any reasonable measure a good one. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had operated from assumptions that last night had put through a significant stress test. He found Ethan first. "I want to make a public statement," Purcell said. His voice was level, professional, but underneath it was something doing the work of being honest. To the chapter, if Mason Reed is willing. On the record. Ethan looked at him. He's willing. Purcell nodded. He walked to where Mason was standing near the barn entrance, talking quietly with Gerald. He stopped in front of Mason, and he didn't preamble it, and he didn't manage it. I judged your people unfairly, he said. Before last night, I had formed conclusions about who you were based on reputation and record, and I was wrong to let those conclusions determine how I acted. Your members saved lives in this county last night. I am publicly and personally acknowledging that and thanking you for it. The barn had gone quiet again the way it kept going quiet when something real was being said. Mason looked at the sheriff for a long moment, the measuring look, the flat, careful eyes reading something that was genuinely being offered, not performed. Thank you for saying that, Mason said. He said it without armor. Directly. It matters. Purcell nodded once. He looked like a man who had just put something down that he'd been carrying for a while. Not shame exactly. More like the effort of holding a position that had stopped making sense. It was Lily who asked the question that nobody else had thought to ask. She had been moving through the barn all morning with her father's quiet purposefulness, refilling coffee, when she found an empty cup, finding extra chairs, introducing herself to people, with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by her own friendliness. She stopped in front of Mason at some point mid-morning and looked up at him with a look. Do you have somewhere to go? She said. Mason frowned slightly. What do you mean? After this, she said. When you leave. Do you have somewhere you're going, or do you just ride? Mason looked at her. He looked at the question the way you look at something that has come at you from an unexpected angle and landed somewhere you weren't guarding. We ride, he said. Lily considered that. That sounds lonely, she said. Not cruel, not pitying, just honest the way children are honest when they haven't yet learned that honesty has to be managed. Sometimes, Mason said. She nodded as if she'd confirmed something she already suspected. Then she said, you can come back here if you need somewhere. She paused. Dad wouldn't mind. I know he wouldn't. From across the barn, Ethan had heard this. He was watching. He did not contradict his daughter. Mason crouched down to her level the way he'd done the night before, the first time she'd walked into the barn with her pot of hot water, and he looked at her with the unguarded expression, the one that bypassed all his careful control. That's a very generous thing to say, he said. It's not generous, Lily said. It's just true. Mason was quiet for a moment. He looked at this 10-year-old girl who sat in a storm shelter for 3 hours and talked to injured men about her mother, and brought coffee to strangers in the dark and offered her home to people who had been told they didn't belong anywhere. You're going to be something remarkable, he said quietly, when you grow up. Lily looked at him with her mother's eyes. I'm already something, she said pleasantly. Then she picked up her empty tray and went to find more things to do. Mason stood up slowly. He turned and found Ethan standing right there close enough that he must have crossed the barn in the last 30 seconds. She's right, Ethan said. You can come back. Mason looked at him. This ranch has a north fence that needs regular maintenance and 16 horses that need exercising, and a single father who is frankly not keeping up with all of it. Ethan's voice was level and matter-of-fact because that was the only way he knew to offer something this large without making it uncomfortable. There's always work here if you need it, any of your men who need it. Mason held his gaze for what felt like a long time. Why, he said. Not suspicious, not testing, genuinely asking with the simplicity of a man who is not used to people offering things without a structure underneath it that he'll have to figure out later. Ethan thought about the gate, about the phone call with Cal and the phone call with Purcell, and the feeling of standing in the rain while the motorcycles came through, and knowing in the bone-deep way he knew things that he was doing the right thing, even though he couldn't have fully explained it. Because somebody opened a door for me once, he said, when I came home from Iraq. When I was not easy to be around and the wiring was bumped and I couldn't hold anything together. Somebody opened a door and didn't ask me to explain myself first. He paused. I've been trying to pay that back ever since. Mason Reed, president of the Montana Hells Angels chapter, former Army Ranger man who had been called dangerous in 9 states and had spent 22 years finding belonging in the only place that had offered it. Mason Reed pressed his lips together once and looked at the floor of Ethan Walker's barn. I don't know what to do with this, he said. His voice, for the first time since he'd stepped out of that column of motorcycles and introduced himself, was entirely without management. "You don't have to do anything with it right now," Ethan said. "It'll be here." The morning moved forward the way mornings do, with the ordinary motion of people eating and talking, and gradually, reluctantly returning to the shape of regular life. Bikes were checked, gear was retrieved, men said things to each other in the economical way of people who've shared something significant and don't need a lot of words to mark it. The townspeople who had come with food stayed longer than they'd intended to, the way people stay longer when the room feels like a place they don't want to leave yet, because they've only just figured out what it is. Gerald found Lily near the horse stalls before he left. He crouched down to her level the way Mason had, and he looked at her with the particular softness of a man who is thinking about his own daughter, 38 years away. "You did good last night," he said, "in that shelter. Danny told me what you did." Lily looked at him. "I just talked," she said. "Talking is doing," Gerald said. "Don't let anybody tell you different." She thought about that seriously. "My mom used to say that listening was the same as helping. She said most people just need someone to hear them." Gerald's face did something that he didn't try to stop. "Your mom was smart," he said. "She really was," Lily agreed. He straightened up. He looked at the horse at Captain, who had been his quiet companion through the night and the morning. He ran his hand along the gray gelding's nose one last time. "Good horse," he said. "He likes you," Lily said. Gerald smiled at that, a real full smile that went all the way up. "Well," he said, "I'll take that." At 11:47 in the morning, the column began to form. Ethan stood at his gate, the same gate he had opened the night before in the rain, and watched it happen. The organization of it. The way 150 men moved into formation with the practiced ease of people who have done this 10,000 times, and find in the ritual of it something that regular life has never offered them: structure, purpose, identity, the feeling of moving through the world as part of something rather than alone in it. Mason came last. He walked his bike through the gate and stopped where Ethan was standing, and they looked at each other in the morning light. "Tell Lily," Mason started, and then stopped because there were too many things in that sentence to finish it simply. "She'll know," Ethan said. Mason nodded. He put on his helmet. He swung onto his bike. He looked at Ethan one more time over the top of it. "You're a good man, Ethan Walker," he said. Ethan looked at him steadily. "So are you Mason Reed?" The engine turned over. The sound of it built and merged with the sound of the other engines until the whole road was vibrating with it, the way it had vibrated the night before in the rain, that same deep mechanical roar that had come out of the dark and frightened the town. The same sound now in the morning light felt entirely different. Not threatening, something more like the sound of people leaving who will be thought about for a long time. The column moved out. Ethan stood at his gate and watched them go. All 150. It took the same 11 minutes it had taken the night before, the same two-wide formation, the same slow and disciplined pace. But where the night before he had waved them in with a flashlight, now he simply stood with his arms at his sides and watched. Lily appeared beside him. She slipped her hand into his without comment, and they stood together at the gate the way they had been standing together, just the two of them, figuring it out for the last 8 months. The last bike rounded the bend in the road and was gone. The sound faded. The road was empty. Pine Ridge sat around them, battered and quiet, getting on with the business of figuring out what had happened to it and what it was going to do next. Lily's hand tightened in his, just slightly. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, Mom would have fed them better than we did." He laughed, again that genuine full laugh that had been harder to come by. He laughed and looked down at her, and she was looking up at him with a face that was doing what her mother's face used to do, being funny and true at the exact same time, finding the thing that was both. "Yeah," he said. "She absolutely would have." They stood there a moment longer. Then Lily tugged his hand. "Come on," she said. "The horses need feeding, and the north fence needs fixing, and there is still casserole in the barn." She was already walking back up the drive when he followed her, and the morning was bright and cold and clear, and the gate behind them stood open in the way of a thing that has served its purpose and doesn't need to be closed again. 3 weeks passed. Pine Ridge rebuilt the way small towns rebuild, not with grand gestures or outside money, or the kind of organized efficiency that looks good in news reports, but with the grinding, unglamorous effort of neighbors showing up for each other, because that is what there is to do, and there is no one else to do it. People took chainsaws to fallen trees on weekday mornings before work. They hauled debris on weekends. The elementary school East Wing got a temporary structure approved by the county within 10 days, which was faster than anyone expected and slower than everyone needed. And the children went back to class in a configuration that was awkward and too crowded and made everyone quietly furious in the productive way that makes communities actually fix things. Ethan worked. That was what he did. He repaired his own fence, checked his own barn, got his horses back on schedule, got Lily back to school, got himself back to the daily rhythm that had been his anchor since Claire died. He woke at 5, worked until dark, made dinner, helped Lily with homework, sat on the porch for his 30 minutes. But the 30 minutes were different now. He wasn't sure how to describe the difference exactly. It wasn't that he thought about the night of the storm constantly. He thought about it the way you think about something that has permanently changed the shape of your interior landscape, present in the background of everything rather than the foreground of anything specific. What was different was that the 30 minutes felt less like endurance and more like actual rest. Like the 30 minutes were no longer the only time in the day that belonged entirely to him, but instead were just the quietest version of a life that had somehow in the course of one extraordinary night become more fully his own again. Lily noticed. Of course she noticed. "You seem different," she told him one evening over dinner. She said it in the same way she said most important things directly without setup, as if the observation were simply the next logical item in a conversation they'd already been having. "Different how?" he said. She thought about it with the seriousness she applied to anything worth answering properly. "Like you've been carrying something for a long time and you put it down," she said. "But you don't know yet if it's okay to leave it there." He looked at his daughter, 10 years old, 11 in March. He thought about what Gerald had said, "She's going to be something remarkable." He thought that Gerald had undersold it. "That's pretty accurate," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her pasta. "It's okay to leave it there," she said, as if it were that simple, and somehow from her it almost was. The story had gotten out within 48 hours. These things always do, especially in small towns, where everyone knows which 3 people you have to tell in order to tell everyone. By the end of the first week, the local newspaper had run a front-page piece, "Hell's Angels Help Save Pine Ridge in Historic Storm," that was picked up by the state wire service, and from there by 3 national outlets. By the end of the second week, Ethan had received 64 phone calls from reporters, declined all of them, and Cal Hendricks had given a single statement on the county's behalf that was straightforward and factual and made no attempt to be more interesting than the truth, which was already interesting enough. The internet, of course, did what the internet does. Someone shared the newspaper article. Then someone shared the share. Within 5 days, the story was on every major platform, cycling through the specific viral pattern of something that catches because it hits a nerve that people didn't know was exposed. The nerve of wanting to believe that people are better than the worst thing you've heard about them, that the story doesn't end where the reputation does, that one night in a barn in Montana can remake what everyone thought they understood about who belongs where and why. Ethan didn't read most of it. He knew it was out there the way, weather is happening in another state present real affecting people he'd never meet, but not his immediate concern. His immediate concern was 16 horses in a north fence and a daughter who needed to be driven to school at 7:45 every morning. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, because Mason Reed had been careful about it, in the specific way that people are careful about things that matter, was what was happening in the Hells Angels network across 5 states. He didn't know about the meeting that Mason called 2 days after they left Pine Ridge in a roadside establishment outside Billings, where he stood in front of 60 chapter members and said without preamble, "There's a man named Ethan Walker in Pine Ridge who opened his gate when he didn't have to. His wife is gone and his ranch is struggling, and his daughter is 11 in March, and we are going to do something about it. I need to know who's in." Every hand in the room went up. He didn't know about the calls Mason made to chapter presidents in Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, and Washington. About the conversation that began with "I need some things" and evolved over the course of a week and a half into something that had logistics and spreadsheets and a project manager named Villanueva, who turned out to have a construction background that he'd never mentioned to anyone in the barn because nobody had asked. He didn't know about the contractors that Brick knew, legitimate businessmen who owed favors, or simply wanted to be part of something that felt right, who agreed to donate labor and materials for a project whose scope kept expanding as more people heard about it and decided they wanted in. He didn't know about Gerald, who had driven back to Pine Ridge on the second day after the storm alone in an old truck and had walked into the diner and sat down across from Donna Hargrove's husband, Frank, and had simply ordered coffee and said, "Tell me what this man needs, not what you think I should hear, what he actually needs." And Frank Hargrove, who was a man working on a longer journey toward honest than his wife, but who was getting there, had told him. Ethan didn't know about any of this. What he knew was that on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the storm, he was in the south pasture checking the fence line extension he'd been planning since spring work. He'd been putting off because there was always something more immediately urgent and never quite enough of him to go around. When Lily came running from the house, in a way she almost never ran, flat out, arms pumping the run of someone who is carrying news that is too large to walk with. He straightened up. His hand went to his phone, instinctively. Bad news. His brain said the automatic reflex of a man who has received bad news before and knows that sometimes it comes in the middle of ordinary mornings. But her face wasn't bad news. Her face was something else entirely. Something he hadn't seen on it in a long time, the specific, bright-eyed, can't-contain-it expression of a child who is about to show you something that has undone them completely. "Dad," she said, and she was out of breath, grabbing his arm. "Dad, you need to come to the front of the house right now." "What is it?" he said. "Just come," she said. "Please, just come." He followed her. He heard it before he turned the corner of the house, voices multiple. The sound of engines, the specific organized sound of a large group of people who know what they're doing and are doing it. He turned the corner and stopped. The driveway, the road in front of the house, the cleared area beside the barn, all of it was filled with people and vehicles and equipment in an organized configuration that made no sense to him for the first 2 full seconds before it suddenly made all the sense in the world. 38 Hells Angels, 4 flatbed trucks loaded with lumber roofing material and equipment, 2 pickup trucks with contractor markings, a cement mixer. A man he recognized as Villanueva standing at the center of it all, with a clipboard directing traffic with the calm authority of someone who has been planning this for 3 weeks and has not left a single detail unaddressed. And Mason Reed leaning against the front truck, arms crossed, watching Ethan come around the corner with the same measuring look that had assessed him across a barn in a storm 3 weeks ago. Ethan stopped walking. He stopped completely. His brain was taking inventory. The trucks, the materials, the people. Mason's face, the clipboard, the equipment, and running it through every framework he had, and arriving at a conclusion that he kept rejecting because it was too large to accept on the first try. "What is this?" he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Mason uncrossed his arms and walked toward him. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at him directly, the way he always looked at things directly. "We talked to Frank Hargrove," Mason said, "and Tom Levitt at the hardware store, and Principal Dorsey, who it turns out knows more about your financial situation than you probably realize, because small towns." He paused. "We know the ranch is underwater. We know you've been cutting corners on the barn repairs since last spring. We know the house needs a roof, and you've been managing that with 3 tarps and a prayer since September." Ethan's jaw tightened. Not anger. Something harder to name, the specific vulnerable tightness of a man who has been private about something difficult and suddenly isn't private about it anymore. "Mason," he started. "We also know," Mason continued, "that your daughter's birthday is in March, and that Claire had a garden she never finished because she got sick before she could, and that Lily goes out and sits in it sometimes, and that you haven't been able to touch it since the funeral." He stopped. "Gerald told me that. He talked to Lily." Ethan didn't say anything. He couldn't right at that moment because his throat was doing something it rarely did, and he was managing it with the same discipline. He managed everything except the discipline was working less well than usual. "We're going to fix the barn," Mason said. "New roof on the house. North fence complete rebuild. The garden, Gerald has a plan for the garden, and he's been talking to a landscape guy in Billings who lost his brother in Afghanistan and wanted to be involved." He paused once more. "There's also a fund, chapters from 5 states contributed. It's not a fortune, but it covers Lily's college if she's careful with it. I'd invests the rest." His voice stayed level through all of this, but the levelness itself was doing work, the work of a man delivering something enormous and trying to do it in a way that preserves the dignity of the person receiving it. And we built a memorial in the garden for Claire. Gerald designed it. It has her name and the date and something that Lily told him Claire used to say. Lily approved it. Ethan looked at his daughter. She was standing 6 feet away, both hands over her mouth, her eyes doing what her mother's eyes used to do, filling up, while simultaneously refusing out of stubbornness and love, and the specific Walker gene that made crying feel like defeat even when it wasn't. "You knew," he said. She nodded, hands still over her mouth. "How long?" She held up one finger. "1 week." He turned back to Mason. He tried to say something. The discipline was not working at all now. He looked at the trucks and the men and the equipment and the whole impossible organized fact of what was standing in his driveway, and he pressed his hand over his mouth the same way Lily had hers, and he stood there for a moment just breathing through it. Mason let him. That was the thing about Mason Reed that Ethan had understood within the first hour of knowing him. He never rushed a man through something real. He waited it out with the patience of someone who has learned that the things worth waiting for cannot be hurried. When Ethan had himself back mostly enough, he looked at Mason and said, "I don't know how to receive this." "You don't have to know how," Mason said. "You just have to let it happen." Ethan exhaled. Long and slow, the kind of exhale that takes something with it. "Wow," he said. He meant it the same way Mason had meant it 3 weeks ago. Not suspicious, not testing, genuinely asking. Mason reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, rectangular object, a plaque, wooden, the kind that a craftsman has made with care and time. He held it out. Ethan took it. He read it. The words were simple. 11 words in clean engraved lettering. "The night you opened your gate, you reminded us we still mattered." Ethan read it twice. Then he held it against his chest and looked at the sky over Pine Ridge. For a long moment, his jaw working, his eyes doing the thing he had not let them do in front of anyone since the hospital room in March 8 months ago. Villanueva appeared at Mason's shoulder. "We ready?" we said. "Ready," Mason said. He looked at Ethan. "We've got 2 days to get the bulk of the structural work done. After that, crews come back in shifts over the next 2 weeks for finish work. You stay out of the way and let us work." "I'm not good at staying out of the way," Ethan said. His voice was rough, but his eyes were clear. "We know," Mason said. "Gerald told us that too." And then the barn erupted, not literally, but in the way of 38 men who have been waiting for the signal and now have it, a controlled explosion of purposeful motion tools coming off trucks, materials being organized with the efficiency of people who plan this and know exactly what comes next. Villanueva was at the center of it, clipboard moving, voice calm and specific, sending men in the right directions, with the quiet authority of someone who has done this in harder places than a Montana ranch. Gerald was already at the garden. Ethan saw him there from across the yard, the old man standing at the edge of the space that had been Claire's project, and her joy, and then her loss before she finished it, standing there with a young man Ethan didn't recognize, who had the careful measuring look of a craftsman assessing a site. Gerald saw Ethan looking and raised one hand, not a wave, a gesture, something between acknowledgement and permission. "This one I've got, trust me," Ethan nodded. Lily had moved in the time he'd been standing with Mason from behind her hands to the center of the activity, because of course she had. She was next to Villanueva now, apparently asking him questions about the lumber specifications, and Villanueva was answering them with complete seriousness, the way you answer someone who has asked a real question and deserves a real answer, regardless of their age. "She's going to run this job by noon," Mason said at Ethan's shoulder. "Probably," Ethan agreed. They watched her for a moment, this girl who had carried hot water through a storm and talked to injured men about her mother and offered her home to strangers and kept every piece of herself intact through a year that would have broken most adults. This girl who was going to be 11 in March and who already was, as she herself had noted something. "Mason," Ethan said. "Yeah, the plaque." He looked down at the wood in his hands. "The night you opened your gate, you reminded us we still mattered." He looked up. "I want you to understand something. It went both ways." Mason looked at him. "When you came through that gate," Ethan said, "I was running this ranch alone, and I was doing it, and I was managing, but there was a part of me that had stopped believing I was part of anything larger than just survival. Just getting through each day and getting Lily to school and keeping the horses fed." He stopped. organized what he needed to say. That night reminded me that doing the right thing for a stranger still matters, that opening a door for someone who needs it still matters, that the things Claire believed in, the things she tried to teach me, they still work. They were still true. His voice had the rough quality of complete honesty, the sound of a man saying the exact thing he means without any management at all. You gave me that back. All of you. Mason was quiet for a long time, longer than he'd been quiet about anything, and this was a man who used silence deliberately. Then we're even, he said finally. The 2 days of work that followed were something Pine Ridge had not seen before and would talk about for the rest of its collective memory. Because it wasn't just the 38 Hells Angels who showed up. By the end of the first morning, Tom Levitt had arrived with 3 employees from the hardware store. By noon, Donna Hargrove's husband Frank was there with a work truck and a look on his face of a man who has been traveling a longer road and has finally arrived somewhere he can be useful. By late afternoon of the first day, there were 60 people working on Ethan Walker's property, a mix that would have seemed impossible 48 hours before the storm and seemed now simply like the obvious outcome of what the storm had made evident. Cal Hendricks came after his shift on the first evening. He changed out of his uniform in his car and put on work clothes and picked up a hammer and found the section of barn wall that needed reinforcing and worked on it for 3 hours without saying much to anyone, which was for Cal its own kind of statement. Sheriff Purcell came on the second morning. He didn't change into work clothes. He worked in his shirt and tie, which was absurd, and he was ribbed about it by Tanner in a way that was merciless and friendly, and which Purcell, to his genuine credit, absorbed with a sheepish grin that made him look 15 years younger. Franklin Henderson came on the afternoon of the second day in a car driven by Ruth, who had decided that his 2 cracked ribs were sufficiently healed that he could at least observe proceedings. Franklin did not observe. He sat in a lawn chair that someone produced for him and directed the work on the garden memorial from there, because Gerald had apparently consulted him on the design. Franklin had known Claire since she was a girl, had coached her at the elementary school 20 years before he coached Ethan in Little League, and his input on what belonged in that memorial was not optional, cracked ribs or no cracked ribs. The memorial went up on the afternoon of the second day. Gerald built it himself with help from the craftsman from Billings, who had lost his brother in Afghanistan, and who worked with the focused quiet of someone putting something of himself into the work. It was a simple stone structure with a bench beside it, the kind of thing you could sit at, which was the point, which was Gerald's whole design philosophy. Because a memorial you can sit at is one that invites you to stay rather than pass by. Claire's name was engraved in the stone, the dates, and below them the thing that Lily had told Gerald her mother used to say, the thing Ethan had been carrying in his chest since March without knowing it was the right thing to put in stone. The bravest thing you can do is be decent when it costs you something. When Ethan read it, he sat down on the bench and put his hands on his knees and stayed there for a while. Nobody disturbed him. The work went on around him, and he sat in Claire's garden at Claire's memorial, and he was with her in the way that you are with someone who is gone. Not completely, not the way you used to be, but in the real and present way of someone who has left their mark so deeply in you that the mark is indistinguishable from who you are. Lily came and sat beside him after a few minutes. She didn't say anything. She put her hand through his arm and leaned against him, and they sat together at her mother's memorial in the garden that Claire had started and never finished. And around them, 60 people were building something back that the storm had tried to take, and the afternoon was quiet in the way of things that have reached their right place. She would have liked Mason, Lily said eventually. Ethan considered this. She would have argued with him about something within the first 20 minutes, he said, and then she would have liked him. Lily smiled. It was Claire's smile, the one that started slow and then arrived completely. Yeah, she said. That's what she did with the good ones. They sat a while longer. Then Lily looked up at him with the clear, direct eyes and said, "Are you going to be okay, Dad? For real, not the way you say you're okay when you're not." He looked at his daughter. He looked at his wife's name in stone. He looked at the activity of 60 people on his property, the barn going up stronger than before the fence line rebuilt the house, getting a roof that would not require tarps and prayers through another Montana winter. He thought about the plaque in his jacket pocket. The night you opened your gate, you reminded us we still mattered. Yeah, he said, not the managed version, not the version that ends conversations. The real one, the one that acknowledges it's been hard and it's still hard and it will probably stay somewhat hard for a long time. and that none of that is the same as not being okay. Yeah, Lily, I think I really am. She leaned back against him, satisfied. Good, she said, because I need help with my math homework, and Gerald is teaching me about fence posts, and Villanueva says I have a talent for project management, and there's a lot going on. He put his arm around her. He laughed. That genuine, complete laugh that had come back to him on the night of the storm and had not fully left since. The last truck pulled out of the Walker property on the evening of the second day. The work wasn't entirely finished. There would be follow-up crews, things to complete the garden, still needed planting in the spring. But the structural work was done, the barn was rebuilt, stronger than it had been. The house had a roof that would last 20 years, and the north fence stood straight and solid in the evening light. Mason was the last to leave. He always was. He found Ethan at the gate, the same gate, the one that had been the beginning of all of it, and they stood together in the way they'd stood before two men at the edge of something, looking at each other across the width of everything the last 3 weeks had been. The fund, Ethan said. I want to do something with it, not just save it. Mason raised an eyebrow. There are veterans in this county who are where you were 20 years ago, Ethan said. Where I was 6 years ago, coming back and not finding the room for what I've become. I want to build something for them, a program, something through the ranch equine therapy job training. I don't know all of it yet. He paused. I could use someone who knows how to organize 47 veterans. Mason looked at him for a long time. You're not going to stop, are you? He said. It wasn't quite a question. I opened a gate, Ethan said. That's what you do with gates. Something moved in Mason's face for the last time, the full version of the expression that had been working its way to the surface since the moment he'd walked into this barn and found a man who looked at 150 strangers in the rain and saw people who needed somewhere to be. It was not a small expression. It was the face of a man who started a night believing he didn't belong anywhere and was ending a chapter of his life, understanding that belonging is not a place assigned to you by other people's comfort. It is a choice you make with the quality of who you are. He held out his hand. Ethan took it. They shook the way men shake hands when a handshake means something firmly held a moment longer than strictly necessary, the kind of handshake that is also a statement. I'll be in touch, Mason said. I know you will, Ethan said. Mason got on his bike. The engine turned over that sound, the one that had come out of the storm, like an army of shadows, and had turned out to be something else entirely. He pulled onto the road and didn't look back because Mason Reed was not a man who looked back, and Ethan stood at his open gate and watched him go until the sound of the engine faded into the Montana evening, and the road was quiet and the stars were coming out over Pine Ridge one by one. Lily appeared at his side. Her hand found his. They stood at the open gate together, this man and his daughter, alone again, in the way that was their life, but alone differently than before. Alone in the way of people who have discovered that they are part of something larger than their own fence line. The plaque was in Ethan's jacket pocket. He could feel its weight there, small and solid and certain. 11 words. He would hang it in the barn, he'd decided. Not in the house, not somewhere private in the barn, where anyone who came through the gate would see it, where it would be a statement about what this property was and what it stood for and what it asked of the people who entered it. The night you opened your gate, you reminded us we still mattered. He had opened a gate in a storm because a man who had been taught to be decent by a woman who understood that decency is not passive, that it is the most demanding and the most essential choice a person can make, because that man could not look at other human beings in need and close the door. And in doing so, he had received everything back that the year had taken from him. Not Claire. You don't get that back. But the belief that her way of moving through the world was right. That opening doors costs you something and is worth every cent of the cost. That the people the world writes off are often the people the world needs most. That a 10-year-old girl carrying a pot of hot water through a storm to feed strangers is the truest possible continuation of her mother's life. That 47 veterans raising their hands in a barn at midnight because someone finally asked them to do something that mattered is the answer to every question anyone ever asked about what these men were worth. The stars were bright over Pine Ridge. The gate stood open behind them. The ranch was whole, again stronger than whole, built back with the hands of people who had come from the wrong side of every assumption and had turned out to be exactly what was needed. Ethan Walker, single father, Marine veteran man, who had opened a gate on the worst night in 50 years because his wife had taught him that the bravest thing you can do is be decent when it costs you something. That man stood in the Montana evening with his daughter's hand in his and felt for the first time in a long time that the life in front of him was something he was moving toward rather than simply through. And Lily, who was her mother's daughter and her father's daughter, and entirely remarkably her own person, looked up at the stars with the same clear eyes that missed nothing and said simply, "Same time next year, you think someone will need the barn." He looked down at her. She looked up at him. He squeezed her hand. "Leave the gate open," he said, "just in case." And that was the whole of it, the storm and the strangers and the night that remade a town reduced to its essential truth. One man who chose decencies over fear, one little girl who already knew that was the only choice worth making, and a gate that would never fully close again.